Throughout human history, people have fallen for some absolutely mind-blowing deceptions that changed the course of entire civilizations. Today, we're diving deep into 7 of the most shocking lies that millions of people believed, and some of these will completely change how you view historical events. Stick around, because number 3 involved a radio broadcast that literally caused mass panic across an entire country. Before we jump in, let me ask you something. Have you ever believed something so completely that when you found out it was false, it actually changed your worldview? That's exactly what happened to entire populations with the lies we're about to explore. These aren't just simple misconceptions or honest mistakes. These are deliberate deceptions that shaped politics, started wars, and influenced millions of lives. What makes these lies so fascinating isn't just their scale, but how they reveal something fundamental about human psychology. We want to believe. We want simple explanations for complex problems. And sometimes, charismatic leaders exploit that natural human tendency for their own gain. The first massive lie that fooled millions takes us back to ancient Rome, but its impact echoed through centuries of European history. I'm talking about the donation of Constantine, a document that supposedly granted the Pope supreme power over Western Europe. For over 700 years, this document was used to justify papal authority over kings and emperors. Here's what supposedly happened. Emperor Constantine, on his deathbed in the 4th century, allegedly wrote a decree giving Pope Sylvester the first dominion over the Western Roman Empire. This meant the Catholic Church could claim authority over all secular rulers in Western Europe. Pretty convenient for the Pope, right? The document described how Constantine had been miraculously cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester, and in gratitude, he was giving the Church temporal power over vast territories. This wasn't just spiritual authority we're talking about. This was actual political control over lands, the right to crown emperors, and the power to depose kings. For centuries, this document was pulled out whenever the Church needed to assert dominance over European monarchs. Kings would literally bow to papal authority based on this single piece of parchment. The Holy Roman Empire's entire power structure was influenced by this supposed gift from Constantine. But here's the thing that makes this lie so incredible. The document was completely fabricated, probably created in the 8th century, over 400 years after Constantine's actual death. Renaissance scholars eventually proved it was fake by analyzing the Latin used in the text, which contained phrases and concepts that didn't exist in Constantine's time. Think about this for a moment. A forged document influenced European politics for over 7 centuries. Wars were fought, kings were dethroned, and entire dynasties rose and fell based on this lie. The fake document literally reshaped the political landscape of medieval Europe. What's even more mind-blowing is how long it took for people to question it. The Church had such authority that challenging the authenticity of the donation was essentially heresy. It wasn't until the Renaissance brought new methods of textual analysis that scholars could safely expose the fraud. Our second enormous lie takes us to World War I and involves one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in modern history. I'm talking about the British fabrication of German atrocities in Belgium that helped drag the United States into the war. When Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, the British government saw an opportunity to influence public opinion, especially in neutral countries like the United States. They created the Wellington House, a secret propaganda department that would manufacture stories about German brutality that were designed to shock and horrify. The lies they spread were absolutely horrific. They claimed German soldiers were systematically cutting off the hands of Belgian children, crucifying captured soldiers and using Belgian civilians as human shields. They published detailed accounts of Germans tossing babies into the air and catching them on bayonets. These stories weren't based on any real evidence. They were carefully crafted propaganda designed to portray Germans as inhuman monsters. The British even created fake photographs and forged documents to support their claims. They distributed these stories through newspapers, pamphlets, and official government reports. The impact was incredible. American public opinion, which had been largely neutral, began turning against Germany. These atrocity stories became one of the key factors that eventually led to American entry into World War I. Millions of Americans genuinely believed they were fighting to save civilization from Germanic barbarism. Here's what makes this lie so sophisticated. The British didn't just make up random stories. They studied psychology and understood exactly what would trigger the strongest emotional response. Stories about harm to children and religious persecution were specifically chosen because they would generate maximum outrage. The truth only came out years after the war ended. Investigations revealed that while there were certainly real casualties and genuine war crimes during the German invasion of Belgium, the systematic atrocities described by British propaganda simply never happened. The scale of the deception was staggering. What's particularly disturbing is how effective this lie was at manipulating public emotion. Even after the truth was revealed, many people continued to believe the original stories. The psychological impact was so powerful that facts couldn't entirely undo the emotional conditioning. This brings us to our third lie, and this one is absolutely wild because it happened in real time with millions of witnesses. On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles broadcast a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds that convinced huge numbers of Americans that Earth was actually being invaded by Martians. The broadcast was presented as a series of news bulletins interrupting regular programming. Actors playing reporters and government officials described Martian spacecraft landing in New Jersey and unleashing deadly heat rays. The performances were so convincing that many listeners who tuned in mid-broadcast thought they were hearing actual news coverage. The psychological impact was immediate and intense. Phone lines across the country were jammed with people calling police stations, newspapers, and radio stations to ask about the invasion. Some people fled their homes, while others gathered weapons to fight the supposed alien threat. There are documented accounts of people having heart attacks from the stress. What made this lie so effective wasn't just the realistic presentation, but the timing. This was 1938, a time of incredible international tension with World War II approaching. People were already anxious about potential threats, so the idea of invasion felt plausible. Radio was still relatively new technology, and people trusted it as a reliable news source. The broadcast exploited several psychological vulnerabilities. First, it used the familiar format of news interruption, which people associated with genuine emergencies. Second, it included specific details like location names and scientific explanations that made the events seem credible. Third, it built tension gradually, starting with small incidents and escalating to full-scale invasion. Here's the really fascinating part. Even though CBS included disclaimers that this was a fictional drama, many people missed these announcements or forgot about them as the story intensified. The human brain, when experiencing fear and adrenaline, doesn't process information the same way it normally does. The aftermath revealed something crucial about mass communication and human psychology. A single radio broadcast had demonstrated the power of media to influence public behavior on a massive scale. This wasn't just entertainment that went wrong. It was an accidental experiment in mass persuasion. The incident led to serious discussions about media responsibility and the power of new communication technologies. It showed how quickly false information could spread and how difficult it could be to correct once people were emotionally invested in believing it. Our fourth massive lie involves Nazi Germany and represents one of the most tragic examples of how propaganda can be used to justify unspeakable crimes. The Nazis created an elaborate mythology around Jewish people that was designed to make ordinary Germans complicit in genocide. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, didn't just rely on crude anti-Semitism. They created a sophisticated narrative that portrayed Jewish people as an existential threat to German survival. They claimed Jews were responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I, the economic crisis of the Weimar Republic, and international conspiracies to destroy German culture. These weren't just random accusations. The Nazis studied successful propaganda techniques from World War I and applied psychological principles to make their lies more believable. They repeated their claims constantly, used emotional imagery, and presented their theories as scientific fact, backed by academic research. The big lie technique was central to their strategy. This involved making claims so enormous and outrageous that people assumed they must contain some truth. Who would dare to make up something so dramatic? The sheer audacity of the lies made them seem credible to many Germans who were struggling with economic hardship and national humiliation. What makes this lie particularly devastating is how it gradually normalized extreme thinking. The Nazis didn't start by calling for genocide. They began with economic restrictions, then social segregation, then dehumanization, and finally elimination. Each step seemed like a logical extension of the previous one. The propaganda was reinforced through every aspect of German culture. Schools taught anti-Jewish curriculum, films portrayed Jewish characters as villains, and newspapers published fabricated stories about Jewish crimes. People were surrounded by these messages from multiple sources, which made them seem like established facts. The psychological mechanism behind this lie was the creation of scapegoating. When people are suffering, they want someone to blame. The Nazis provided a simple explanation for complex problems and offered the promise of national redemption through elimination of the supposed threat. The tragedy is that many ordinary Germans genuinely believed these lies. They weren't all evil people who wanted to commit genocide. They were normal humans who had been systematically deceived by one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it explains how decent people can become complicit in horrible crimes. Our fifth enormous lie takes us to the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, where an entire economic system was built on fabricated statistics and impossible promises. For decades, the Soviet government convinced millions of people that their communist economy was rapidly overtaking capitalist countries, when in reality, it was falling further behind every year. The Soviet statistical system was essentially a massive lie machine. Local officials would report inflated production numbers to avoid punishment. Regional authorities would add their own exaggerations, and the central government would publish these fictional achievements as proof of communist superiority. This wasn't just innocent optimism or accounting errors. Soviet leaders knew they were publishing false information, but the lie had become so central to their political legitimacy that they couldn't admit the truth without undermining their entire system. They had painted themselves into a corner where success had to be reported regardless of reality. The fabrications were incredibly detailed and sophisticated. The Soviets published statistics showing rapid growth in steel production, agricultural output, and industrial capacity. They claimed to be producing more grain than the United States, more steel than Britain, and more tractors than the rest of the world combined. Meanwhile, the actual Soviet economy was struggling with chronic shortages, inefficient production, and technological backwardness. Store shelves were often empty, basic consumer goods were unavailable, and industrial equipment was decades behind Western standards. What makes this lie particularly cruel is how it affected ordinary Soviet citizens. People sacrificed their present happiness for a promised future prosperity that was never going to arrive. They worked incredibly hard under difficult conditions because they believed they were building a superior society. The international impact was enormous. Many intellectuals in Western countries believed Soviet claims and advocated for similar economic systems in their own nations. The false statistics influenced political movements, academic theories, and government policies around the world. The lie was so comprehensive that even many Soviet leaders eventually believed their own propaganda. They made economic decisions based on fabricated data, which created a feedback loop of increasingly unrealistic planning and deeper economic problems. The truth only became undeniable during the final years of the Soviet Union, when economic collapse made it impossible to maintain the facade any longer. Even then, many true believers refused to accept that the statistics had been fabricated for decades. This brings us to our sixth massive lie, one that might surprise you because it involves the early days of the tobacco industry. For over 50 years, tobacco companies successfully convinced millions of people that cigarettes were not only harmless, but actually beneficial for health. Starting in the 1930s, tobacco companies launched sophisticated marketing campaigns that featured doctors endorsing cigarettes, athletes crediting smoking for their performance, and scientists presenting fabricated research showing health benefits from tobacco use. The companies hired real doctors to appear in advertisements, claiming that cigarettes could help with digestion, reduce stress, and even treat respiratory problems. They funded research studies that were designed to produce favorable results and suppressed any studies that showed negative health effects. What makes this lie so insidious is how the tobacco industry exploited people's trust in medical authority. When people saw doctors in white coats recommending specific cigarette brands, they naturally assumed this advice was based on legitimate medical knowledge. The companies also used sophisticated public relations techniques to create doubt about emerging evidence of health risks. Even when studies began showing links between smoking and cancer, tobacco executives publicly questioned the research methodology and demanded more studies. They created fake grassroots organizations that appeared to be independent consumer groups, but were actually funded by tobacco companies. These organizations would testify at government hearings and publish articles questioning anti-smoking research. The psychological manipulation was incredibly effective. Tobacco companies associated smoking with sophistication, rebellion, relaxation, and social success. They created powerful emotional connections that made people want to smoke regardless of health concerns. For decades, millions of people genuinely believed that smoking was safe or even beneficial. They trusted the scientific-sounding claims in advertisements and dismissed health warnings as exaggerated or politically motivated. The truth only became undeniable when internal tobacco company documents were revealed through legal proceedings in the 1990s. These documents showed that company executives had known about health risks for decades, while publicly denying any dangers. Our final lie brings us to more recent history and involves the 2003 invasion of Iraq, based on claims about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be completely false. This lie demonstrates how modern governments can still deceive their populations, even with advanced media and communication technology. The Bush administration presented detailed intelligence reports claiming that Iraq possessed chemical and biological weapons and was developing nuclear capabilities. Secretary of State Colin Powell gave a famous presentation at the United Nations showing photographs, intercepted communications, and scientific analysis that supposedly proved these weapons existed. The claims were specific and alarming. Officials described mobile biological weapons laboratories, stockpiles of chemical weapons, and uranium purchases that could be used for nuclear weapons. They warned that these weapons could be transferred to terrorist organizations or used against American allies. The psychological impact was powerful because these claims came just 2 years after the September 11th attacks. Americans were genuinely afraid of terrorism and willing to support preemptive action against perceived threats. The government exploited this fear to build support for military intervention. What makes this lie particularly significant is how it was presented. Unlike historical examples of obvious propaganda, these claims were supported by intelligence agencies, endorsed by respected officials, and presented with apparent scientific evidence. The media largely accepted and amplified these claims without sufficient skepticism. Journalists who questioned the evidence were often dismissed as unpatriotic or naive about national security threats. The truth became clear after the invasion, when extensive searches found no weapons of mass destruction. Later investigations revealed that much of the intelligence had been unreliable, misinterpreted, or deliberately exaggerated to support predetermined policy goals. The consequences were enormous. The invasion led to hundreds of thousands of casualties, destabilized the entire Middle East region, cost trillions of dollars, and damaged America's international credibility for years to come. What's particularly troubling is how this lie succeeded, despite the existence of skeptical voices and alternative information sources. Unlike historical examples where information was tightly controlled, this deception occurred in an era of widespread internet access and independent media. The success of this lie demonstrates that even in the information age, governments can still manipulate public opinion through selective presentation of evidence, exploitation of fear, and appeals to patriotism and national security. Looking at all these lies together reveals some disturbing patterns about human psychology and social manipulation. Each of these deceptions succeeded because they told people what they wanted to hear, provided simple explanations for complex problems, or exploited existing fears and prejudices. The lies that lasted longest were those that became integrated into institutional structures and cultural beliefs. Once a lie becomes part of how society organizes itself, challenging it becomes incredibly difficult because it requires admitting that fundamental assumptions were wrong. What's most concerning is how these patterns keep repeating throughout history. The specific details change, but the psychological mechanisms remain the same. People are still vulnerable to charismatic leaders who offer simple solutions, still willing to believe claims that confirm their existing biases, and still susceptible to fear-based manipulation. Understanding these historical lies isn't just about learning interesting facts from the past. It's about developing the critical thinking skills necessary to recognize manipulation in our own time. The same psychological vulnerabilities that allowed people to believe these lies still exist today. The challenge is that in our current era of information overload and competing narratives, it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between legitimate sources and sophisticated deception. The techniques used by historical propagandists have been refined and amplified by modern technology. The antidote to being deceived isn't cynicism or paranoia. It's developing healthy skepticism, seeking multiple sources of information, and understanding how our own psychological biases can be exploited. We need to be especially wary of claims that seem too convenient, that demonize entire groups of people, or that demand immediate action without time for reflection. These 7 lies changed history and affected millions of lives. They remind us that truth isn't always obvious, and that even intelligent, well-meaning people can be systematically deceived. The price of freedom really is eternal vigilance, not just against external enemies, but against those who would manipulate us through our own hopes, fears, and prejudices. The next time you encounter information that seems designed to make you angry, afraid, or righteously certain, remember these historical examples. Ask yourself who benefits from your belief, what evidence supports the claims, and whether you might be seeing what you want to see rather than what's actually there. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that the biggest lies are often the ones we most want to believe.